We're going to be talking about naming conventions and rules for naming variables and functions in programming languages. When it comes time to create a variable or a function in a program, you need to make sure that you give them names that meet certain standards. Now, there are rules that you must meet for any variable or function name, but there are also conventions, and these are kind of the standard way, the way you want to do it because it's how most people do it. Now, rules are just that. They're the rules. If you break a rule, it doesn't work. It's just not going to function correctly. If you break a convention, it's still going to work, but your boss might be mad at you. Okay. So, for both variables and functions, specifically relating to a language like C++, for example, variables and functions have the same rules and, for the most part, the same conventions. Other languages might have slight differences here and there, but the rules are pretty much always the same. So let's talk about the rules first. Now, there are three primary rules that we need to concern ourselves with. The first rule is one of the more difficult ones because the key is how it's stated. Most people, when they refer to this rule, they will state it as a variable name can't start with a number. Now, while this is true, it's not the whole truth. You can't start a variable name with a number, like 9 something. And this has to do with the way variable names and, in fact, names of any object are related and stored in memory. So, when you create a variable name, you can't start it with a number. But you also can't start it with a $sign or a pound sign or most of the other special characters on your keyboard. What you want to stick with are the A through Z. Lowercase, uppercase doesn't matter as far as the rule is concerned, but you definitely want to stick to the letters A through Z. So the better way to state that rule then, instead of saying doesn't start with a number, you want to say that a variable name must start with an alpha character, A through Z, or an underscore being the only exception. And again, in convention, you typically don't use that. But for the rules purposes, a variable name must start with an alpha character or an underscore. The second rule then kind of takes that one step further and says that a variable name cannot contain spaces of any kind or any special character. So a variable name can't contain any spaces, no space bars in there, and no special characters like the $sign, the pound sign, the caret symbol, any of those types of things. The third rule then is that with any programming language, you're going to have words that are specific to that language. Now, sometimes these are keywords, which typically represent commands. These are things that are built into the language that the language absolutely knows this word is mine. Then there are also certain reserved words. Reserved words are not necessarily built into the language, but they are words that were added to the language in other means that, again, they're reserved. They're words you should not use for creating your variables and things. The keywords are easy. When you're dealing with a software like, say, Visual Studio, and you're typing your code, if you happen to type a keyword, it's going to turn blue because Visual Studio uses a color scheme as you're typing your code. So if something turns blue and you're trying to make that a variable, you know you have to stop. Reserved words are the ones that are a little bit different. But fortunately, our conventions, which we'll talk about next, are going to make it a lot easier for us to avoid using a reserved word. So let's review those rules one more time. The first rule, a variable name must start with an alpha character or an underscore. The second rule is variable names cannot contain spaces or special characters. And the third rule is that you cannot use reserved or keywords of the language. Those are the rules. It's only 3 of them, not too bad. But now we talk about the conventions. Now the conventions are the ones, like I said, they are the general way that it should be done. They're the accepted format, kind of the standard of naming variables and functions. Now the first one is, it's addressed a lot of different ways. The simplest way to put it is we call it camel casing. When you think about a camel, what's a camel have that no other animal has? They have humps, right? And where is that hump? Is the hump at the front of the camel? No. Is the hump at the back of the camel? God, I hope not. The hump's in the middle, right? So if you have a variable name, and typically when you're naming your variables, and we'll get to this one in a moment, they typically are longer, like multi-word things, like student age, for example. So if that was going to be my variable name, everything would be lowercase, all the characters would be lowercase, except for the A in age. So you have, so that you can read it, STUDENTAGE. So you see how you get nice and flat, and then the A is the hump, and then it comes back down, right? And the hump's in the middle. So all the letters in a variable name should be lowercase, except the first character of the second or consecutive words after that. And that's really the verbose way to state that convention, but for ease, we just call it camel casing. Think about the humps, okay? Now our second convention deals with the fact that we want to make sure that any variable name we create makes sense. So when you're naming your variables, you want to avoid things like stuff, or other stuff, or more stuff. While these might make perfect sense to you at the time, and hey, you're the one writing the code, you're the one writing the program, you know what it means. Unfortunately, you're probably not going to be the only one that ever sees the code. Somebody else might have to debug it, somebody else might have to make changes to it or make modifications down the road. So and even you may have to come back to it 6 months or a year later to make a modification or an update. And are you going to remember exactly what stuff was supposed to be? Maybe not. So you want to use words that make sense. The easiest way to remember that is name that variable in such a way that the name represents what's in it. Again, student age, for example. Now I could say stu age, S-T-U-A-G-E. Somebody might look at that and say, what's stewage? You know, okay. But student age, there's no interpretation there. It means age of student, right? So you want to keep your names descriptive. That's your second convention. The third convention deals with the length of a variable name. While descriptive variable names are important, what you want to avoid is getting silly. This is the variable I will create to store the ages of all the students in my classes. No. I don't even want to type that once, much less the 3 or 4 times I may have to type it in a particular program. That's a little too much. Short is better. Depending on the book you read, some books will say 12 characters or less. Some will say 15 characters or less. Really, the number of characters isn't as important as just making sure, be descriptive, but don't be ridiculously descriptive. The last convention doesn't deal necessarily specifically with creating variables, but creating a special kind of variable. And that's what we call a constant. Now, in some programming languages, you don't have the ability to create constants, but in your C-based languages, C, C++, C#, Java, these languages have the ability to create constants. These are special kind of variables that once created as a constant, you can never change. So for these types of variables, we want to always name them using all capital letters. So for instance, if I was going to create a variable to store the relationship between the diameter and the circumference of a circle, I would call it pi, capital P, capital I, all caps. That way later on in the program, I'm not going to inadvertently change the value of pi to 10 because as soon as I type it with all caps, I remember, oh yeah, all caps, that means it's a constant. I'm not supposed to change it. Now, it wouldn't let you change it anyway, but it's a reminder. Again, it's a convention. So let's review the conventions. We have camel casing, we have descriptive, we have keep them short, and we have the all caps for constants. So 3 rules, 4 conventions. As long as you stick to these, you should be fine in any programming language, and you should be fine in any work environment, because these are generalized. When you go to work somewhere and you actually start doing programming for another company or specifically under someone else's tutelage, they might have their own special circumstance, standards, or conventions that they want you to follow, but these will still be there. So that is the rules and conventions of naming variables and functions.